Hey there. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Julia Hirschberg, the owner, founder of Reactive Therapy and Wellness here in the Los Angeles area, and joining you on this really lovely Friday to talk more about one of my current obsessions, which is the autonomic nervous system. And you can find us here every week chatting about what we're learning and what we're doing as a neurologic therapy practice, as educators of other PTs and OTs in the field. So today we are going to talk about the autonomic nervous system and the eye, and coming at it from a PT OT perspective. I'm not a neuro-optometrist, and I do work with some really awesome neuro-optometrists who have really helped me in this understanding. And in fact, it has been my patients going to work with some specialist neuro-optometrists across the world in this field that has informed me a lot in this area. It caused me to kind of go down a rabbit hole of different literature and research in this field, and then I just have to share it with you. And in particular, last Friday, I had a patient who had a constellation of symptoms that were really screaming autonomic nervous system. And in fact, I went to the Compass 31. It's a self-report measure for autonomic symptoms. By the way, I really love using this. I found this recently. And I was asking her those questions, and she literally had all of them. So dry eyes, dry mouth, bouts of diarrhea, a lot of sensitivity to light. In fact, so much it was causing some difficulty with her mobility. And so then I asked her, I know her doctors well. Have you talked to your doctor about the autonomic nervous system? Is this something you've like heard of? And she's really astute, and she's like, I don't think so. And so then I just simply told her, I said, all of those signs and symptoms could be consistent with autonomic nervous system involvement. And we talked through each of them. And she was really intrigued to learn more. And because, of course, I'm obsessed with it, I was excited to talk about it. And in particular, she was interested in the eye symptoms. And so I was like, well, I brought out some of my drawings that I have from neuroanatomy and showed her how the autonomic nervous system directly influences the eye and can contribute to the things that she was having, like her light sensitivity and dry eyes, for example. So that really spurred me on for today's topic. We're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system with the eye, what you might listen for, just like in that patient that I had, that would hint at the involvement of the autonomic nervous system with the eye, what tests that we might do, one of which, honestly, I just learned about this week from my amazing colleagues across the country. Actually, both of them were in Canada, so go Canada, teaching me things. Great therapists across the world that I get to work with. So what tests we can do, and then what can we do for treatment? And I'm not really talking about eye treatment because, again, let's leave that to the pros, which are the neuro-optometrists. Let's talk about autonomic treatment. So first, let's start off simply with the anatomy. So in the autonomic nervous system, we've got the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system has specific input into the eye, as does the parasympathetic. And let me just talk about what happens when the sympathetic nervous system has influences, what it does to the eye. So number one, if we think of sympathetic, of that fight or flight, evolutionary, like we're being hunted. Okay, so I know that's not happening right now, but let's take that, because I think sometimes if I think about that, like we're animals here, it's really helpful. And so when that occurs, our sympathetic nervous system is going to help us, and it's going to dilate our pupils so we can let in more light, particularly if it's at night, right? So dilate our pupils, let in more light, let us be more aware of our surroundings, so that we could be safe, right? That makes sense. It's also going to accommodate our lens for far vision so we can see far around us versus up close. Um, Also, our lacrimal glands, so the glands that produce secretions in the eye, are going to be inhibited, hence the dry eye, right? We don't need tears getting in our way when we're running away from the tiger. So those are a few. By the way, I will put a link to a really great article, which is called The Autonomic Nervous System and the Eye. By the way, great. Tons of anatomy, so it might be a little heavy. It took me a few days to get through, to be honest. There's actually a lot more that goes into the autonomic nervous system and the eye. The aqueous humor, for example, the blood supply, all of that changes with the sympathetic parasympathetic system. Circadian rhythm and light coming in and even head position influences that our circadian rhythm, which is part of the higher level control of our autonomic nervous system as well. It's so fascinating. So that's the sympathetic. Let's think of the parasympathetic. So this is more of our resting state. So this is like curl up, read a book, right? So our pupils constrict. We do not need to collect all the extra light. Our lens accommodates for near vision. So we can read a book or do another fine motor activity. And then we also have our lacrimal glands increase secretions. So we get more wet eyes. And the pieces of anatomy that I love for this, by the way, are in the brainstem and above. So in the brainstem, we have our good old Edinger-Westphal nucleus, small nucleus that has input from from various areas of the brain in the autonomic nervous system, and output through our cranial nerve 3, our oculomotor, and parasympathetic fibers to control some of these things, like the pupil and the accommodation. But if we go even broader than that, and this is why we can see a lot of the eye autonomic dysfunction in things like functional neurologic disorders, post-concussion, and in brain injury and stroke, is because the control of this, the descending control, comes from a lot of these areas that are sensitive and in the autonomic nervous system. So things like the hypothalamus has some input through one of the nuclei, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this is part of the piece that helps control circadian rhythm. So if you've also, that person might have some sleep dysfunction. That's something commonly that I see. The habenula, I don't know if you remember this from neuroanatomy, it's part of the limbic system, and it has direct connections from a small percentage of retinal ganglion cells, and then multiple connections in the brainstem. It registers some of the changes in light. It's involved in modulating some of our dopamine and serotonin systems. Oh my gosh, struggling with that word today as well. So we have that connection into the eye. Another one to think about as well is our superior colliculus, because this has connection with the eye to help us maintain our posture. So there's much more, by the way. Again, a whole entire article on it, which I found very fascinating. But we have to think just beyond some of the reflexes and some of the major areas of the visual system, but where this gets integrated in the brainstem. So interesting. So that's the anatomy. I already kind of told you a little bit about what you might hear, what a person might report. So the dry eyes, light sensitivity because the pupils are dilated and a lot of light is coming in. Visual sensitivity in general because, again, the pupils are dilated and they're taking in a lot of information. Great if you're like in the jungle running away from a tiger, but not so much if you're in our day-to-day here in Los Angeles. So other things, double vision, particularly with reading or difficulty converging, bringing the eyes together, because that again is something that the parasympathetic controls, is that convergence, and the sympathetic really focuses outward for far vision instead of that close vision. So we might hear all of those things. We might hear that there's difficulty with the changing of light, so going from bright to dark. Maybe the pupillary response is kind of sluggish. And we may also hear other autonomic symptoms, so constipation, diarrhea, erectile dysfunction, orthostatic hypotension, heart rate swings, sweating, urinary retention, heat intolerance. All of these would point to other systems involved in the autonomic nervous system. So I put those pieces together. That's when I start hearing all of those together, I am definitely thinking autonomic. And then we might want to test it. So I've got to tell you, because now I'm really interested in this. There is an app that a couple of my colleagues use. It's called the Reflex App, PLR Analyzer. I'll put a link in here as well, actually, because it looks really interesting. And if you were looking for ways to better quantify autonomic involvement, this would be one way. And I don't use it yet. I am doing a demo of it next week. I would really like to use it, but basically looking at the pupil size and responses, how quickly they respond. This is done in the research world. I actually spoke to my colleague at the Brain Sport Institute at UCLA, and they do use this in research, and he was kind of intrigued about how we might use it clinically. So that would be one way to measure specifically with the eyes, right? Right now, what we can do is our good old pen light, and we could look at the response, and we can compare side to side. But I like the idea of being able to look at it a little more specifically. And again, I really like to use the Compass 31 now as a screening tool, self-report. So that has an eye symptom section. So Compass 31, the pupillometry is what that's called, that Reflex app that I mentioned. Looking at eye movements and looking at the ability to converge. So I do see a lot of people who have that convergence insufficiency. And then looking at all of the other things as well. So response to temperature, response to breath, heart rate variability. This is something I've been experimenting with myself. Really love. I've been using a portable EKG. EKG is the most reliable and gold standard for looking at heart rate variability. So I've been using one. To be continued. I'll have to do a little live on that and let you know what I think of it, because it's only been well, almost 2 weeks that I've been using it so far. So not just looking at the eye autonomic control, but some of the other pieces that are involved in the autonomic nervous system to see if those are potentially related. So that is how we might test it, right? So the last thing that I said is, what might we do for treatment? So again, if I find some difficulty with their eye motor control that is beyond me, so I will often refer to a neuro-optometrist. I feel very lucky that we have really great neuro-optometrists in our areas near our clinic that we collaborate with, and that's been really awesome. So that is definitely an option. But there is a lot, if it's autonomic control that we're looking at, then it's autonomic treatment that we can go to. So for one is even looking at exercise tolerance and heart rate variability. Can that be trained? So for example, the heart rate monitor that I'm wearing provides feedback and leads me through some breathing activities to manage my autonomic nervous system. So that might be one avenue of treatment to start, is look at heart rate variability biofeedback, and breathing. And then again, if you had the app like I want to get to measure that pupillary response, what you would look for is that improves with autonomic training. So heart rate variability training, breathing training are two big pieces of that. Another thing that we use a lot is grounding. So a grounding activity is an activity that brings the nervous system really in tune with your sensory system and where you are supported in space. So I know I've done other videos. You can look for those on a grounding activity. That's an autonomic nervous system toning activity that can really change some of these factors. So I highly recommend grounding activities. Yoga is a really great activity that combines breathing plus the grounding plus movement. And I have found that very toning to the autonomic nervous system. And again, you can actually see if some of those things change the sensitivity in the eyes, because as the autonomic nervous system tone improves, so that drive, that balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic, then you would see a change in some of those other symptoms as well. So that's just a little bitty start to it. If you've been with us a while, you know we actually did a webinar on the autonomic nervous system and put a bunch of the practices in there. So I'll throw a link in here if you're interested in that that webinar. It's recorded. Also, there's a copy of the Compass 31 as a part of the resources and downloads with that. It's really been, we've gotten great feedback about that webinar. I also want to put out there, we have another webinar coming up, and it's on another part of the nervous system that's highly influenced by the autonomic nervous system, and that's the otoliths. The otoliths are a part of our vestibular system. They tell us where, how we're responding to movement and gravity and acceleration. And so this webinar is coming up June 4th, so just in a couple weeks. And I'll put a link in here. It's another free webinar. We tend to do these webinars on those things that we don't talk a lot about in school. So things that are researched and evidence-based, but less well known in the PT or OT community. So this is another one of them. So I'll put a link in there. Looks like I just put the wrong link. So let me grab a different link, and I'll put a link into our webinar, and I'll be talking about the otoliths for sure next week as well, because there's so much that we're learning about this, in particular with a lot of the types of disorders that we work with and talk about. So one last thing here too, I'll put a copy of our grounding worksheet here. So if you're not familiar with it, I just put a link in the comments. We have a grounding worksheet that you can follow and do yourself and do with patients. I found it really helpful. So thank you so much for joining me today, talking about the autonomic nervous system and the eye. I have found this area so fascinating, and have found that we can really help people in this area. So I hope you found this helpful too. Please share this with others. Again, I think it's not talked about enough, and I hate for it to go unnoticed. So have a great day, have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.